Millionaire CEO interviews a single mom. Everyone rejected, then learns why. Marcus Hale realized something was wrong the moment he sat down. The conference room was almost empty, the lights slightly dimmer than usual, and the air carried that quiet heaviness that settles after a long workday. This interview was supposed to be a formality, a courtesy visit before he left the building. Instead, it felt like he had stepped into the middle of a story already unfolding. Across the table sat a woman who did not match the list in his folder. Her posture was calm, her hands steady, her expression composed in a way that suggested she had learned how to wait without expecting much. Marcus glanced at the schedule again, then back at her, sensing a disconnect he couldn't immediately explain. This wasn't supposed to happen. The system had already filtered the final candidates, reviewed weeks ago by layers of software and human oversight. Yet here she was, sitting quietly, meeting his eyes without urgency or fear. If you believe in compassion and the quiet strength of ordinary people, take a moment to like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us how one small act can change everything. For a brief moment, Marcus considered ending the meeting. It would have been easy, efficient. No one would have questioned it. The process would remain intact, untouched by hesitation. But something in the stillness of the room stopped him. Rachel Monroe did not look like someone who had slipped through a crack. She looked like someone who had been waiting at the wrong door for a very long time. That realization made Marcus pause longer than he intended. He felt the familiar pressure of time closing in. Flights to catch, calls waiting, a calendar that rarely allowed space for detours. This interview was already unnecessary by corporate standards, and yet, walking away felt heavier than staying. Marcus leaned back slightly and asked the question he hadn't planned to ask. It was simple, it was quiet, and it changed the direction of everything that followed. Because in that moment, Marcus was no longer deciding whether to end an interview. He was deciding whether to listen to something the system had already chosen to ignore. Marcus Hale had built his career on clarity. Numbers made sense to him, systems reduced chaos, and decisions felt safer when filtered through data rather than instinct. As founder and CEO of a company valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars, he trusted the structure he had helped design. Hiring, especially, had become a process he rarely questioned anymore. Rachel Monroe sat across from him with none of the nervous energy he usually saw at the end of interview days. She didn't fidget, didn't oversmile, didn't rush to fill the silence. Her calm felt earned, not rehearsed, as if life had already taught her that urgency didn't always lead to better outcomes. Marcus noticed this before he noticed anything on her resume. He glanced again at the folder in front of him, already aware that something didn't add up. The name on the page matched the name she had given, but the status was clear: rejected. The system had flagged her profile weeks earlier, filtered out by criteria. Marcus himself had approved without a second thought. Rachel was a single mother, something Marcus would later realize the system never explicitly rejected, but quietly penalized. Gaps in employment, non-linear career paths, experience gained outside traditional roles. None of it triggered alarms individually, but together they pushed her profile out of contention long before a human ever looked at it closely. The recruiter sitting nearby shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable. This interview wasn't supposed to happen. It existed because of a scheduling oversight, a missed update, a simple administrative error that no one had bothered to correct. From a procedural standpoint, ending it now would be the cleanest solution. Marcus felt the weight of that expectation. Efficiency had always been praised in his world. Fix the error, move on, protect the system. That mindset had served him well for years, building something scalable and respected. Yet sitting in that quiet room, he felt an unfamiliar tension between what was correct and what was convenient. Rachel seemed aware of the imbalance, but she didn't react to it. She wasn't trying to sell herself or justify her presence. She answered the questions she was asked, waited when there was silence, and met Marcus's eyes only when it felt appropriate. There was no performance in her behavior, only presence. As Marcus listened, he became aware of something unsettling. He knew everything about how candidates were filtered, ranked, and rejected. He knew almost nothing about what happened to the people behind those decisions once the system moved on. Sitting across from Rachel made that gap impossible to ignore. By the time the recruiter cleared their throat again, gently reminding him of the time, Marcus realized the interview had already crossed an invisible line. This was no longer about filling a role. It was about understanding what the system had missed, and whether he was willing to confront that truth. And as Marcus prepared to decide what to do next, neither of them yet understood that this conversation was about to push both their lives in a direction neither had planned for. The recruiter tried one last time to steer the moment back into something tidy. He leaned in slightly, voice low, and suggested they wrap it up since the system had already made its call. It wasn't rude, just practiced, the kind of reminder people give when they believe rules matter more than nuance. Marcus could have nodded, thanked Rachel for coming, and walked out without anyone blaming him. Instead, Marcus did something he hadn't done in a long time. He looked past the folder, past the status on the page, past the invisible authority of the process, and he asked for a minute, not to double-check numbers, not to consult legal, not to protect the company, just a minute to decide what felt right. The room went quiet in a way that made the recruiter shift back in his chair. Rachel watched him carefully, but she didn't plead. She didn't soften her voice or try to be charming. She simply waited, hands resting calmly, shoulders squared but not defensive, as if she already knew how this usually ended and didn't want to make it harder. That restraint hit Marcus harder than any desperate pitch would have. Marcus leaned forward slightly and asked Rachel to stay. He didn't make a grand announcement. He didn't say he was reversing anything. He just said, "If you're okay with it, I'd like to keep talking for a few minutes." It sounded simple, almost casual, but it carried weight because it went against the momentum of the room. The recruiter looked surprised, then uncertain, then quietly resigned. Marcus could tell he was thinking about precedent, about policy, about fairness to the other finalists. Those concerns mattered, but in Marcus's mind, a different kind of fairness had suddenly surfaced. The fairness of letting a person speak when they'd been rejected before anyone bothered to listen. Rachel nodded once, a small gesture, and said, "Sure." Her voice was steady, not relieved, not excited, just present. It was the response of someone who'd learned not to celebrate too early because life had a way of changing the rules without warning. Marcus noticed how little emotion she used to protect how much emotion she carried. He asked her to start from the beginning, not the resume version, but the real version. He wanted to know what she did now, what her days actually looked like, and what she hoped this job could change. Rachel answered slowly, choosing honest words over impressive ones, and the story that began to unfold felt more real than anything in the folder. By the end of those first few minutes, Marcus realized the interview wasn't continuing because of a mistake. It was continuing because he had made a choice, and once that choice was made, it couldn't be undone without revealing something about him that he wasn't ready to face. As the conversation deepened, the room seemed to grow smaller, not because of tension, but because of how exposed everything suddenly felt. Rachel spoke without embellishment, describing her days with a matter-of-fact honesty that left little room for interpretation. Mornings started early, nights ended late, and most decisions revolved around keeping her household stable enough to function another week. She explained what it meant to manage work, childcare, and constant uncertainty without any safety net. There was no partner to call, no family nearby to step in when schedules collapsed or emergencies hit. Every choice she made carried weight, and every mistake felt amplified because there was no one else to absorb the impact with her. Marcus listened, aware that this part of the story would never show up in an application field. The system tracked dates, titles, and credentials, but it didn't record exhaustion, resilience, or the quiet discipline required to keep moving forward without reassurance. Rachel wasn't presenting herself as a victim, but the vulnerability in her words made the cost of survival unmistakable. She admitted that she almost hadn't come to the interview, not because she didn't want the job, but because she had learned to recognize rejection before it arrived. The email had never come, the call had never followed, and experience had taught her that silence usually meant no. Showing up felt risky, emotionally and logistically. Sitting there, Rachel knew she was already behind candidates with cleaner timelines, uninterrupted careers, and more flexibility. She wasn't asking for sympathy, but she was tired of being invisible. Saying that out loud, even once, felt like standing without armor. Marcus felt an unexpected heaviness settle in his chest. He wasn't uncomfortable because the story was dramatic. He was uncomfortable because it was ordinary. This wasn't an exception or a rare case. It was a reality the company's systems quietly filtered out every day without consequence. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the distance between the metrics he trusted and the lives they represented. The realization didn't come with panic or guilt, but with a slow, unsettling clarity. Rachel wasn't failing the system. The system had simply never been built to see her. And as Rachel finished speaking, a silence filled the room that no spreadsheet could resolve. Marcus understood that whatever decision came next, it would say something permanent about what kind of leader he was willing to be. The shift in the room didn't come from a dramatic confession or a sudden emotional break. It came from something Rachel mentioned almost in passing, as if it were too ordinary to matter. She said she already knew the building, not as a visitor, not as a candidate, but as someone who had spent years inside it when most people were gone. Marcus looked up, confused, and asked what she meant. Rachel explained that years earlier she had worked there on the night cleaning crew. She came in when the office lights dimmed, when the elevators were quiet, when the people with titles and authority were already home eating dinner. She wasn't part of the day shift world. She was part of the invisible world that made the day shift possible. She described the routine without bitterness, just clarity. Conference rooms with chairs pushed back in uneven lines after long meetings. Whiteboards filled with plans and big words she had no context for. Half-empty cups of coffee left behind near laptops and printed reports. Sometimes the room still smelled like cologne or perfume, like the energy of people who had been speaking confidently about decisions that would affect hundreds of lives. Rachel said she used to recognize names without ever meeting the people. Not from introductions, but from labels on office doors and printed meeting agendas left on tables. She learned what departments existed by cleaning around their workspaces. She learned what roles carried status by noticing who had private offices and who didn't. She didn't resent it. She just noticed it, the way someone notices weather. Marcus felt a quiet discomfort rise, because he had walked those same corridors for years believing he understood his company. He knew the org chart, the revenue streams, the growth projections, the internal culture initiatives, yet he had never thought about how many people move through that same space without ever being acknowledged as real participants in the story. Rachel explained that during those years she had been almost silent by necessity. Cleaning work required efficiency and discretion, and most people avoided eye contact late at night, as if noticing the staff would make them feel guilty. Rachel learned to move carefully, to make spaces look untouched, to erase signs of other people's lives without leaving evidence of her own presence. That kind of invisibility became a habit, and habits tend to follow you even after the uniform is gone. After her husband died, she said, her life narrowed fast. She wasn't trying to reinvent herself in a dramatic way. She was trying to stabilize. She tried to shift into work with better hours and better pay, something that could hold her household steady. She took online courses late at night, squeezed in learning between responsibilities, and applied for entry roles that promised growth. Most rejections came quietly, without feedback, without a real person ever explaining what was missing. Rachel admitted that the hardest part wasn't being told no. The hardest part was being erased. She could accept rejection if it came with clarity. What wore her down was the silence, the sense that her effort didn't even register. She didn't say this with anger. She said it like someone describing a pattern they'd seen so many times it stopped feeling personal and started feeling structural. Marcus realized then that the system hadn't failed to recognize Rachel's potential. It had never been designed to read her life correctly. Her path was non-linear because life had been non-linear, and the company's filters treated that as risk. This wasn't about one candidate slipping through a crack. This was about the company's idea of ideal, quietly excluding people who had learned strength the hard way. The room felt different after that. Marcus noticed the recruiter's posture tighten slightly, as if even he sensed the conversation had crossed into territory that couldn't be smoothed over with process language. Rachel remained calm, but something in her eyes suggested she was bracing for the moment to be minimized, for her story to be politely acknowledged and then discarded. Marcus didn't minimize it. He couldn't, because now he wasn't only hearing a candidate's background, he was seeing his own building through a lens he'd never used before. And once you see that kind of truth, you can't unsee it, even if you want to. Marcus didn't respond right away, not because he lacked words, but because he was recalibrating the way he listened. The interview had shifted from evaluation to understanding. and he knew that returning to standard questions would only flatten what had just surfaced. Instead of asking Rachel to defend her past, he asked her to walk him through decisions she had made when options were limited, moments where there was no ideal outcome, only the least damaging one. Rachel spoke about choices that never appeared on resumes and never impressed algorithms. She explained how she had chosen flexibility over prestige because being available for her child mattered more than titles. She talked about turning down roles that demanded unpaid overtime she couldn't afford, and about walking away from opportunities that assumed support systems she simply didn't have. Each decision sounded ordinary on the surface, but together they revealed a pattern of judgment shaped by responsibility rather than ambition. Marcus asked how she learned new skills without formal mentorship or institutional backing. Rachel explained how she taught herself late at night, often after her child was asleep, using online materials she found on her own. She learned quickly, not because she was naturally gifted, but because mistakes had immediate consequences. There was no buffer, no team to absorb failure. Adaptation wasn't optional, it was survival. As she spoke, Marcus recognized something uncomfortable. The company spent millions of dollars trying to teach adaptability, resilience, and accountability through leadership programs. Yet here was someone who had developed all three without support, recognition, or reward. Not because she wanted to stand out, but because life had demanded it. That realization shifted the meaning of potential in Marcus's mind. The recruiter sat quietly, aware that the conversation had crossed into unfamiliar territory. This was no longer about verifying qualifications or checking boxes. Marcus wasn't lowering standards or bending rules. He was questioning whether the standards themselves had become detached from reality. The room felt heavier, not tense, but consequential, as if everyone sensed that something larger than a single hire was being examined. Marcus began asking questions about collaboration and conflict, not as theoretical exercises, but as lived experiences. Rachel described resolving disagreements with supervisors who didn't understand her constraints, advocating for schedule adjustments without sounding difficult, and managing expectations when flexibility was mistaken for lack of commitment. Her answers weren't polished, but they were consistent, revealing a quiet leadership style shaped by necessity rather than authority. What struck Marcus most was how little Rachel framed her experiences as sacrifices. She didn't describe herself as someone who had been wronged or deprived. She spoke as someone who made choices based on values, even when those values weren't rewarded by systems designed for linear success. There was no bitterness in her voice, only clarity. That clarity unsettled Marcus more than anger ever could. He realized he wasn't fighting the process or defending Rachel against unseen opponents. There was no antagonist in the room. The struggle was internal. Marcus was confronting the gap between what the company claimed to value and what it actually rewarded. This wasn't rebellion, it was accountability, and it required more courage than defiance. As the conversation stretched on, Marcus glanced at the time and felt a familiar pressure rise. Flights missed, calls piling up, obligations waiting. Normally, that pressure dictated his decisions. This time, it didn't. The cost of rushing suddenly felt higher than the cost of staying. He understood that some moments demanded presence more than efficiency. By the time Marcus set his pen down, he knew that whatever decision followed would mark a line he couldn't step back over. Even if Rachel didn't walk out with an offer, the company would no longer look the same to him. Listening had already changed him. The only question left was whether he was willing to let that change shape action, not just awareness. Marcus felt the shift before he fully understood it. The interview had reached a point where continuing as usual felt dishonest. What had started as a conversation about skills and fit had quietly transformed into something deeper, something that challenged the assumptions he carried into the room. Rachel hadn't asked for sympathy or special consideration. She had simply spoken truthfully, and that truth refused to stay contained. He glanced again at his notes, realizing how inadequate they were. Bullet points and short phrases failed to capture the complexity of what had been shared. Rachel's story wasn't messy because it lacked structure. It was messy because life had required constant adjustment, and no system he knew how to design accounted for that kind of intelligence. This wasn't a flaw in her profile. It was a flaw in the lens. Marcus spoke carefully, choosing words that reflected responsibility rather than authority. He admitted that the company relied heavily on filters meant to remove bias and streamline decision-making. Those tools had been praised for fairness, yet he now saw how easily fairness became rigidity when context was stripped away. Saying it out loud felt risky, but necessary. Rachel listened without interrupting, unsure where this reflection would lead. She had seen people acknowledge problems before without taking action. Understanding didn't always translate into change. Still, hearing her experience articulated by someone with influence felt unfamiliar. It wasn't validation yet, but it was recognition, and that alone carried weight. Marcus realized that this moment wasn't about correcting a single hiring decision. It was about confronting a pattern he had helped normalize. The system hadn't rejected Rachel because she lacked ability. It had rejected her because her life didn't follow a path the system knew how to reward. That realization made the choice ahead heavier than he expected. He acknowledged something else, something harder. Hiring Rachel would not be a quiet decision. It would ripple outward, raising questions about other candidates who had been filtered out for similar reasons. It would force conversations he hadn't planned to have yet. This wasn't generosity, it was accountability, and accountability rarely arrived without discomfort. Rachel sensed the gravity of the pause that followed. She didn't try to reassure him or downplay the implications. She had learned that minimizing herself never protected her in the long run. If this opportunity came with weight, she was willing to carry her part honestly. That steadiness strengthened the moment rather than softening it. Marcus looked at Rachel and understood something that hadn't been clear before. Leadership wasn't always about making bold moves or public statements. Sometimes it was about recognizing when the rules no longer served the values they were meant to protect. This decision wouldn't earn applause. It might not even be noticed immediately, but it would matter. He also realized that whatever happened next would define more than Rachel's future. It would define his own. Ignoring what he had seen would be easier in the short term, safer for momentum and optics. Acting on it meant accepting responsibility for change, even if that change unfolded slowly and without recognition. As the conversation paused, the room felt suspended between past assumptions and future consequences. Rachel remained composed, Marcus thoughtful, both aware that this moment marked a point of no return. The interview had already done its work. The only question left was whether courage would follow understanding, or whether insight would quietly fade back into process. After Marcus stepped out of the room, the silence settled slowly, not sharp or sudden, but heavy in a way Rachel knew well. She stayed seated, hands folded in her lap, posture steady even as tension pressed into her chest. Waiting was not new to her. It was something life had trained her for, patiently and repeatedly. Still, this pause felt different. It carried a possibility she didn't want to trust too quickly. She let her eyes move across the room, noticing details she hadn't paid attention to before. The clean table, the muted lights overhead, the glass walls that made everything visible and distant at the same time. This was a space built for decisions, not vulnerability. Sitting there alone, Rachel reminded herself that being heard did not guarantee being chosen. Experience had taught her that understanding and outcomes rarely arrived together. In the hallway, Marcus reopened his folder, though the pages no longer felt authoritative. The candidate profiles looked thin now, stripped of the context he could no longer ignore. Most timelines were clean and uninterrupted, rewarded in predictable ways. Success followed order. Rachel's profile stood apart, not because it lacked effort, but because it reflected a life shaped by responsibility rather than convenience. As Marcus compared the resumes again, a pattern became impossible to dismiss. The system favored continuity over resilience, availability over accountability, polish over lived experience. It wasn't designed to harm anyone. It was designed for efficiency, and that efficiency quietly filtered out people whose lives required adaptation instead of optimization. Rachel wasn't an exception. She was proof of a broader omission. The realization pressed inward, uncomfortable but clarifying. Approving this hire meant more than filling a position. It meant acknowledging that tools he trusted had blind spots he was responsible for. Fairness, he understood now, wasn't achieved through neutrality alone. Neutral systems still reflected the assumptions behind them. Awareness demanded response. Inside the room, Rachel focused on breathing evenly, grounding herself in what she could control. She didn't rehearse answers or imagine outcomes. She reminded herself that she had spoken honestly, without shaping her story to fit expectations. That mattered, regardless of what happened next. Hope could motivate, but she had learned how heavy it became when held too tightly. Marcus leaned against the hallway wall for a moment, feeling the tension between habit and responsibility. For years, he had trusted systems to carry judgment so he didn't have to. Delegating decisions to tools felt objective, safe.